electronic equipment should all come with an unwritten warranty that it will let you down in public. So, and I see I have a nice typo that should say beginnings. I think the Genesis 1 story is very well known in Christian circles and beyond. It sits right at the beginning of the Hebrew Christian scriptures, and for a very long time, and when I say a very long time, I mean well over 100 years, probably closer to 150 years. It has been caught up in what I think is an endless debate between creationists and evolutionists. And when I was younger, I invested some effort and time in this debate, gathering evidence. I want to bypass the debate completely today. And so if you ask me questions about creation evolution, I'm going to smile at you and cough a little bit and pretend I didn't hear you. But why am I disinterested in the debate? I think it's important to think about this. And the reason for that is that this debate sits astride what's known as an epistemological error, an epistemological error known as a split epistemology. Now, for those of you who are not philosophically informed, epistemology is a branch of philosophy that studies the theory of knowledge, how it is that we go about the task of knowing. And it's actually a very fascinating area for me. I am not an epistemologist. I have a professor who was one, and when he talks, it's like, whew. You know, I can figure out some things, but his language and all this, it's like way over my head. And so I have boiled it down to a very simple one. But I like this quote from Friedrich Osterhoff. The term epistemology or theory of knowledge refers to the system of thought that for any given society answers questions as to what can be known, how and why it can be known, and how certain human knowledge is. And so when we talk about an epistemological error, we're talking about a mistake that's made in the process of knowing. And here's an introduction to the mistake. If you would like some profound reading, Leslie Newbigin is a good man to read. He was an Anglican bishop who went to India as a young man and spent about 40 years there as a missionary. But some of the books he's written are fascinating. They have been very beneficial to me. And this one is from a book, Proper Confidence. He talks about how in the Western world we can have confidence in our faith. It's a very interesting book. But he says here, a little reflection, of course, will show that all human knowing involves both a knowing human subject. So notice that you have to have something to do the knowing. A human being has to be there to do to process. Okay? A computer is a what? Weak substitute for the human mind, right? It can do some things faster, but you know, all you have to do is pull the plug and it's over, right? Which is not true about the human mind. So you have to have a knowing subject and something that is the object of the subject's inquiry. So he talks about two poles in epistemology, the subjective element, which is the person doing the knowing, and the objective, which is the data that gets processed, okay? And all knowing takes place in this dynamic between a subjective element and an objective, okay? Oh my, I forgot about this. This is my version of what I call a knowledge equation, just to show you how knowing takes place. On the one side you have data, objective things. In the biblical world it's the scriptures. On the other side you have subjective things, ideas, opinions, presuppositions, and faith, and then that's the system side, and then you have this thing called reason that operates between the two and thereby produces knowledge. And if you accumulate bits of knowledge, you get subject matter. So I used this in a class for many years, teaching at Walla Walla University. Every branch of knowledge, this fits every branch of knowledge, okay? And please notice here the presuppositions. I put it in red. Philosophically, those are also known as posits. These are the initial points that you believe in order to start the process of knowing. Newbigin was famous for saying you can know without doubting, but you cannot know without believing. You have to believe something in order for the process of knowing to even function. And those posits have fascinated me for many, many years. But Oh, I have some more here. In the biblical world, this knowledge equation is informed by revelation, which affects the data side and the system side. And this is something that I think, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's kind of a tangent to what I'm saying. I'm just talking about epistemology here, is that for many years, people have thought that the data side was the only thing that counted, and we forgot that people bring opinions to the data. I was talking at lunch to this gentleman here, and we were talking about scientific studies. And does it make a difference who paid for the study? See? And I talk to students, and they like to think of science as very unbiased. And I say, well, what about who paid for the study? And then they all laugh, because they know that somehow if you pay for the study, oftentimes the results tend to be on your side a little bit. And that's a bit of a cynical view, but it makes the point. So, yeah, something very important, I think I'm talking about this too, there's someone that does the knowing, and they come with some bias. Now, split epistemology occurs when the subjective element and the objective element are split apart, and you pretend that the one doesn't exist or the other. And so in the creation-evolution debate, if you look at the conservatives versus the liberals, the one side denies the subjective side and the other denies the objective side. And the way it works is this way, is that conservatives like to use the objectivist approach. They want to take the story and deny it any subjectivity. They want to treat it like data. All right? But if you look at the progressive side, they take the subjectivist side and they say, well, it's only a story, it's a fantastic, and I use that in its original sense, unbelievable, fantastic sense, that was written by people long ago before they really knew about how things operate, and it's just an old story that they cooked up. See? And so you split these two apart, and what you end up with is a debate that is interminable. It's never going to end, and it's never going to come to a conclusion. Because if you're on the conservative side and you bring evidence, the subject, if you're on the objective side of this argument and you bring all your data, the subjectivists are going to make it subjective. And if you are a subjectivist and they bring hard data, you're just going to, it's never going to work. And so for that reason, I have lost interest in the debate. There is some value in it, but you're not going to prove it, okay? And the sad thing is that creation-evolution debate causes us to miss what I think is the real grandeur of the story. And that's what I want to look at here, okay? Please notice Genesis 1 is a story, it's not data. And the debate, by the way, between creation and evolutionists implies that the only way to find real knowledge is by empirical investigation. And we in the Western world have elevated empirical learning to the premier place. If you really want to know, you have to do it the scientific way. And I like to remind people that there are a lot of real things that cannot be proven objectively. Love is not subject to critical analysis. Beauty is not. Justice is not. And nobody will say those things are not real. Okay? That objective investigation is very useful when dealing with matter and energy, but not with a lot of other things in human life. And it's also true that if you believe in a supernatural realm, the methods of science do not apply, because by definition, the supernatural world does not operate by the rules of the natural world. Okay? And so that's another reason why the debate seems to me to go on endlessly. So I want us to look here, and I want us to look behind the story, if I can put it that way, okay? What lies behind the story? What assumptions are found residing behind the story that you read in Genesis chapter 1, okay? And stories, by the way, are very interesting. There are a lot of people who like to claim that the Bible is mostly commandments and this and that, and actually it's mostly stories. Okay? It's mostly stories, not theological statements. Why? Because they're engaging, they're memorable, they endure for generations, they're transportable, they're easily understood in cross-cultural situations as long as you explain the cultural nuances. And I'm sure all of you can remember stories you heard when you were little kids. I mean, that's how durable a story can be. So this is a story. And what happens in cultures is that many little stories are cobbled together, and I use that word on purpose. They are cobbled together into a big picture story, right? In the Bible, it's the story from Eden lost to Eden restored. And we were talking in Sabbath school, I think, where that actually the Adventist understanding of the story of the Bible is more comprehensive than a lot of other ones, because it begins with the story of the origin of evil with Lucifer and goes all the way to the restoration of the universe back to its pristine nature. So that's the big picture story. But stories also have explanatory value. And I like this. I grew up in Africa, where there are a lot of stories that are explanatory. Like, I can tell you a story of why hippopotami, are grumpy, they have no fur, and they live in the river. Do any of you know why? Well, your culture is lacking. It doesn't have a story to tell you that, okay? There's lots of African stories that tell details like that, and I'm not going to tell you that story now because we don't have time. For a small fee, I'll tell it to you at the end. But these little stories, stories that have explanatory value, are what provide the context for our living, right? That in order to make sense out of your life, you have to have a picture of grand reality, as I call it, into which you can fit yourself, okay? And here, this quotation, given the nature of narrative, even theologically driven narrative, the normative values reflected must often be derived by inference, and that's the point I want to make here. When you have a story, the question is, so what? What's the point of the story? And oftentimes, it's not direct, it's by inference. You read it and you say, oh, this implies thus and so. And so that's what's behind what I want to do here today. And notice, you ask questions like, what view of God, the world, humanity, and relationships among these three does this account reflect? How does this relate to the normative view? So, as I say, we want to look through stories in order to see what kind of assumptions, what kind of a reality exists behind the story. Okay? So, stories of origins are particularly significant. And I don't just mean that in the Bible, I mean that in all cultures. Because if you're going to make sense out of life, you have to be able to explain where we all came from, or where everything came from. You have to have a beginning point. Okay? And you can't see the diagram very well, but this is an artist's depiction of an ancient concept of reality. And you can see here, the earth is here with lots of water. This is Sheol, or hell. You have the pillars of the earth, and you can read ancient writings that talk about the pillars of the earth that go down into the water. And you ask, well, where do they go down? Nobody knows the answer to that. They just go down. At the edge of the earth is the abyss of water. And then there's the waters above the firmament. Here's the firmament with the sun, the moon, and stars. And it's obvious if you go down and lie down in a field at night where there's no ambient light that the sky is a dome. You can see plain as day, it's a dome, right? They didn't have telescopes. And then, of course, where are the gods? Well, they live above all of that. The gods live up here and there are windows that the gods can look down through, and they can send pestilence, and they can send blessings, rain and stuff down on people. And so the whole of religious structures in some of the ancient pagan religions was designed to prompt the gods who lived up here to behave well and do beneficial things for humans down below. Now, I don't think any of you subscribe to this picture. Your picture of reality is very different. But you know how many thousands of years people lived successfully under this one? Which makes the point, stories of origin don't have to be true to convey truth. Just think of that. Okay, so these stories describe the widest parameters. And so that's the first thing I want to look at here. That in the Western world, when we look at the story, and I want to say something about the structure in the Genesis story. We tend to think of it as a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sequence. It's not exactly like that. If you look at the story, there's a sequence, but it goes like this. It begins with a summary statement, and you all could recite it to me. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the summary statement. And then you have a list of 3 domains being made. Light and dark, dry land, and so forth. And then the next 3, those domains are populated, sun, moon, and stars, and it goes down like that. And then you have a summary statement at the end. See? So it's not a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, if I can put it that way. So does it make a big difference? No, it just solves some of the problems you have when you try to make it a straight sequence. Okay? So, I want to make one more observation. I'm taking a long time to get to what I want to talk about here. Please remember that the story in the Bible is a story of order overcoming chaos. Now, we don't realize how significant that was to the ancient world. Okay? For them, chaos was the big worry, because what happens if in the fall it's getting dark and darker and darker and darker and things are dying? We're going to all die, unless what? Somehow that process is reversed. See? And so they worried a lot about disorder overtaking order in the natural world. So an earthquake would have been a source of great panic, pestilence. And so this story would have been very interesting to them, because it begins that the world was out form and void. It was in chaotic state. And how does it end up? Yeah, very well ordered, a nice home for the created beings. And so this would have been of great interest to them if they'd all heard it. See? So if you look through the story, and by the way, I love this picture. I have to talk about this picture. This is an artist's depiction of the universe. And you'll notice that if you look over on this side, there's this bucolic scene. There's this nice little village around a lake here and all the farm fields and the trees. And on the dome of the sky cuts across here with the sun and the moon and the stars, okay? And what I like about this is here's a curious human being who's done what? Yeah, he stuck his head through the dome of the sky. And what does he see behind it? Well, he sees the rolling spheres and the wheels within wheels. See? He's trying to figure out what's behind it that's making all of this run. Now, this is not an accurate description of reality, but I love the picture, especially this guy right here. He somehow got his head stuck through the dome of the sky. He's looking behind there to see how it all works. So, to look now exactly at the story, and I'm going to be looking behind the story, it begins with these famous words, "in the beginning," and I want you to stop right there. What assumption or concept sits behind these words? Well, it's talking about time, right? In the beginning. So it tells you that there was a point of beginning. And please notice Genesis 1 is not the statement of earliest beginnings in the Bible. John 1:1 is. In the beginning was the Word, and was with God, and the Word was divine. That's the beginning of things. This seems to be the beginning of life on earth. Okay? And it does not support creation ex nihilo. Ex nihilo is the creation from nothing. Genesis 1 doesn't support that. Because what does it say? The earth was without form and void. There's something there God is already working with. So that's not the origin of all things, it's the origin of life on here. But notice that time is a factor here. A question? Out of nothing. Yeah, out of nothing. What you discover here is that time is a part of reality. And very interestingly, philosophically, this talks about one of the biggest debates, the most consequential debates in all of human history. It's had the biggest effect on Christian theology of any debate. And the debate is like this. What is the relationship between time and ultimate reality? And this was a big issue with the Greek philosophers because of the way they viewed the universe. I already mentioned I had a great thought. The ancient people tried to understand and explain what the qualities of ultimate reality might be. And in their minds, it boiled down to the question of ultimate reality being static or dynamic. You see, the interesting thing here is that if ultimate reality is dynamic, then our experience is one way. If it's static or timeless, then reality is another way. And the debate here comes mostly from people like Plato, who proposed that there's a two-tiered universe. There's a non-material realm of absolute perfection where everything exists in concept. He called it the forms. And then you have the material realm where the forms are represented in some diminished form. Okay? So what can we pick? An example. I'll pick a house. The concept of a house exists in perfection in the realm of the forms, and every house that's built on earth is an attempt to replicate the ideal. Okay, so there's no perfect house. And by the way, the concept of absolute perfection comes from this, because in the realm of the forms, there is no error, omission, or mistake of any kind. But it's theoretical world. It's like mathematical formulas. Okay, and so the question they face here is that if this realm exists in perfection, okay, if this realm exists in perfection, it must be static. You know why? Because if something is perfect and it changes, it's not going to become more perfect. What's it going to become? It's going to become less perfect. And so they could not imagine ultimate reality being, time being an element of ultimate reality, because time produces change. See? And so they have this big debate. Something cannot change to become more perfect. It will only come less perfect. And so in consequence, if being existed in a perfect state, it had to be timeless. Okay? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this becomes very significant, because when the biblical world ran into the Hellenistic world, the biblical people had to now start explaining biblical things in terms that the Greek world understood. And one of the challenges now, how do you talk about God? Where is God going to be? Is he going to be in the realm of perfection or in the material realm? And your answer would be, and what did you just do to God when you put him up there? Yeah, you made him into the equivalent of a mathematical formula. He's no longer a being, and he's static. There is no past, present, and future with God. And by the way, this is where the doctrine of predestination comes from, because God knows everything in the moment. Okay. But God is now also not accessible, because you cannot reach out to the timeless zone. You're in the temporal zone. And so what you find here is that the whole idea of an immortal soul, by the way, comes from this. It's the means by which the essence of being comes from the timeless world into the temporal world. Plato proposed this, that you have a soul. What is a soul? It's an inherently immortal essence of you. And of course, in Christian theology, especially by Aquinas, it takes up residence in human form at the point of conception, and then it stays there until you die, and then it goes to its destiny. But the soul does not die. Does not die. And by the way, those of us who talk about God keeping souls alive in heaven are misspeaking. God is not keeping souls alive. They are inherently alive. They don't die. So nobody has to keep them alive in hell. I always want to know how a material substance like fire could burn an immaterial thing like a soul, but nobody's ever answered that question for me. Pushing God into timelessness in one way put him in a zone of perfection, but it robs him of the qualities that you see in the Bible. Because these words say, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. In other words, those first words tell us that God is not in the timeless zone. He's active in space and time is a factor in reality. Okay? It's a piece of reality. Am I too technical here? You're all smart people. Okay? So what Genesis 1 does is the first thing it tells us is that time is a part of our reality, that God is not outside of time. He's inside. He has access to time. But it's a qualified thing. God is not limited by time like we are, but he has access to time. And actually I had a physics student explain this to me one day, and it was very helpful. He said, well, think of it this way, is that you and I are like people on a football field. If we want to go from midfield to the end zone, we have to run each yard, 50 yards. But God is like that little camera that's computer controlled. It can go anywhere. It's not limited. It doesn't have to, and I thought, well, that's true. God has access to time. He's not tied to time. It's called temporal eternity. God is eternal, but he has access to time. We are temporal beings. We cannot escape time. But the point here is that the God of the Bible is not timeless. This story tells us right from the beginning that God has access to time, and is active in time and history. And this becomes very significant also in the fact that also the Bible, God interacts with humans and God reveals himself in time. See? So a second thing about this is that the concept of time is also laid out here. There are two main temporal concepts in the world, that time is linear or time is recursive or circular. It makes a big difference to things. Circular concept sees time kind of like a merry-go-round. Time is going round and round and round and round, and you get on the merry-go-round for a while, and then you die and you fall off. And in some systems, you get reincarnated and you have another go-around. But history itself is not going to anywhere. It's not moving to any destiny. It's just going round and round, round and round, round and round. And you know, if you subscribe to Hinduism or stuff, the journey of the soul is very, very long, and there's a very dim concept of any destiny. Okay, linear. Yeah. So if time is circular, it has some implications. The cosmos must have been eternal. There was no beginning point. It just has always been there. History is not going anywhere. And this one strikes me. There would be little to no incentive to change or develop. And by the way, this explains one of the reasons why when you go into some cultures in the Eastern world, there's no sense of progress. In the caste system, it's never going to change. Okay? You come into the Western world, especially in the Protestant world, and maybe I'll get ahead of myself here, but it's very different. This one bothers me a lot. If time is circular, there's no final place of peace and rest. It's not going anywhere. You're just going to keep going round and round and round. Yeah, there's no urgency. No urgency. If time is linear, though, it's very different. Because linear time would see time more like a wagon wheel on a horizontal axis, so that when it rolls, it actually is moving somewhere. It's going down the road. Okay? And it's making progress in a particular direction, which proposes that we're headed for a destiny. There is a destiny that's coming. It infuses life with urgency. And some of you may have grown up in a time where you had a Protestant work ethic instilled in you. That your father told you what? Son, every minute counts. Don't waste it. Right? Don't waste it. And so in the Protestant world, we get up early, we work late, we never take vacations, we're always working, getting things done, see? Because time is going somewhere. If you go to Europe and you look at the Protestant section of a city versus the Catholic section, you will find very different work ethics, very different stress levels, let's put it that way, because in the Protestant area, they're up early. In the other area, they're up whenever. You know, there's not the same sense of urgency. Okay, and by the way, this helps explain why human achievement is not evenly distributed across cultures. The cultures that have circular time have no incentive to grow and change. The ones that are linear, what we didn't do today, we should have done yesterday. Okay, so if time is linear, then the cosmos would have a beginning point, and this is exactly what the Genesis story teaches. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. History is going somewhere. Change and progress and development are real and are desirable, actually. Since there was a beginning, it's right to expect a destiny. And this one I like a lot. The prospect of a final resting place becomes a real possibility. Time is linear. It started here. It's going there. If there was a beginning, we should expect an end. So the story, I think, is very significant. The Genesis story is very significant in that it tells us that time is linear and get on with the business of living. Yeah, we're on the way to the future. Yeah, this is very different from, in fact, this is one of the unique things about Hebrew culture, ancient Hebrew culture, that somehow out of the Middle East, where most cultures viewed time as circular, this one group comes out seeing it as linear. It's a remarkable difference between ancient Hebrew and the rest of the world. Okay. Another thing about this story is it presumes the existence of deity. In the beginning, God. And notice here that there's no attempt to argue it, there's no justification for it, there's no philosophical debate. It's an announcement that part of reality includes deity. In fact, deity is the formative element in this, and it fascinates me. It's very different from the theologians who have gone around to try and prove the existence of God. The Bible, the Genesis story, announces it, okay? Which tells you, by the way, that, I do want to make this point, that the arguments in favor of the existence of God are useful to help establish it once you believe it, but they don't go do a lot of good to create people into believers. It doesn't work that way. So, what this means is in the biblical story, God is adopted as one of the what's called ontological elements. That every worldview has a set of assumptions that are called an ontological set. And in the biblical world, the existence of deity is one of those. Some of the other ones have to do, is time linear or is it circular? Is the human capacity to reason something real, or is it? Another question you could ask is, are we part of a reality, or is this just an imaginary existence like a dream from which you'll awaken one day? See? In the biblical story, in the Genesis story, God is placed there as one of the foundational elements of reality. It's announced. Okay. I've been talking about that, yeah, foundational assumptions. Oh, you want that picture? I'll go back to it. And let me say something about ontological sets. They are adopted, not proven. This is something that's very hard for us to imagine because we like to prove everything. But the initial points that you adopt for a thought system cannot be proven because they have to be placed down before your criteria of truth are established. See? Yeah.
Doesn't a constitution say these things are self-evident?
Yeah, but self-evident to whom? It's self-evident to a certain group of people. And you know, today there are a lot of people who think the Constitution should be changed because those truths are not self-evident to them. See? Those truths were self-evident to the founders, and to people like you and like me, they make sense. But to people from elsewhere, those don't make sense because the frame of reference is very different. See? So I make this point because, well, I'll use an example. You know, a person who does not believe in any supernatural, who believes that the universe is only matter and energy, can that be proven? No, what people say is we've checked all over the place and that's all we've ever found. Therefore we conclude it's only matter and energy. You know what that is? That's an argument from silence. Very poor argument. I could say to you, we have no evidence of unknown diseases. Now, why did you laugh, Marshall?
Well, because there's no evidence until there is.
Yeah, see, when I tell you there's no evidence of unknown diseases, of course there's no evidence for that unknown disease, but what do we have? We have plenty of other unknown diseases that became known. See? So be careful about arguing from silence. It's a very dangerous thing. It's a very weak thing. And so, you know, there's no way to prove that there's nothing beyond the natural world. There's no way to prove that. You can adopt that. And nobody says, well, you have to prove that. But if I want to put God as a founding principle, I have to prove that. See, there's a double standard there. Anyway, what am I saying here? With the announcement of deity, we need to stop again, for the introduction of a deity, uncovers a whole lot of other things to be considered. First of all, the presence of deity necessitates some discussions about the grand picture of reality. What does reality look like? Okay? And I think I have here several examples of this. And I don't know that I need to talk about this one. Yeah, ontology wants to know what exists, what the stuff of reality is made of, but I'm trying to say, what is the grand concept of reality that allows for deity to exist? And Genesis 1 provides us that picture, okay? It creates a mind map, and basically what it says is that reality consists of a two-tiered universe. There's the realm of the creator and the realm of the creature. See? That's what the story pictures. If you look behind the story, if there is a God, there must be a domain in which the God exists, which is different from the domain in which we exist. See? The supernatural realm exists there. I'm going to run through these. I don't know how interested you'll be in them, but there are at least 6 competing concepts of grand reality. And I will dash through them. None of these are empirically provable. Okay? They're all adopted by acts of faith. The first one is that reality is random. And I put this dotted circle, and I run into people every now and then who think that grand reality cannot be understood. It's a random thing. And what prevails? Luck? Good luck and bad luck, because some things are good, some things are bad, but you can't make any kind of rational sense out of reality, so don't even try. It's all random. This is a very problematic one because it doesn't pass its own test. You cannot prove a random thing by being random. You have to explain it in concise, rational terms to try and explain it, right? And if random is true, then if I just say blah, 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 it should be the same as a sentence. This one has no. Another one is that reality consists primarily of a non-material spiritualized zone, and that the material world is basically an illusion. That there are people who believe that the experience we have here is kind of like a dream from which we will awaken. Okay? It's not the really real. The really real is in another zone. And I used to think very few people subscribe to this, but actually anybody who believes in transcendental methodologies of the mind subscribes to this. You know, when Shirley Lane talked about, New Age people talk about what do they call it? Channeling or escaping the current reality to get your mind out of the material world into the supernatural world, and you can wander back and forth through time and meet people just as a mind. You know, Hinduism has a good dose of this. This is one of the concepts of reality. Another one is the materialist one, which argues that the supernatural realm is an imagination. It's a phantom of people's imagining. That the world is a hard place, it has ups and downs, and so we comfort ourselves by imagining that there's another realm where good exists and God exists and He takes care of us, but we have no proof of that, and therefore, if you really want to do well in life, grow up, get rid of your fantasies and face reality as it is. See? By the way, these people make very good ecologists because they say this is all we have, let's take care of it. And they say that religious people have an escape clause that one day Jesus will come and save you even if you wreck the world. There's a point to be made there. Okay. But this is another one, and this is a very powerful view of reality today. It's probably the most prominent one in the Western world. It's very, very robust. It's displacing other pictures of reality quite dramatically. This one, if you grew up in another culture, you'll understand it better than we do. This proposes a two-tiered universe with a supernatural realm and a natural realm, but these two are very closely intertwined. That the spiritual realm is all about us. That there are spirits of various kinds that are right here with us, and that many of them are evil. And so divination, certain kinds of offerings, appeasing the gods, divination, all of these kind of things are used to navigate, to provide a bubble of safety for you in a very dangerous environment. Now, medieval Europe was like this, when you have hobgoblins and what other things did they have? Yeah, trolls and ghouls and all these kind of things. And darkness is a very scary thing, because that's when these things all come out, and if you make a mistake, they'll get you. You know, I had a Vietnamese student some years ago, and he laughed one day, just started laughing when I talked about this. I said, "Why are you laughing?" He said, "Well, you're talking about my grandmother." I said, "What do you mean about your grandmother?" He says, "Every night my grandmother takes a bowl of food and she puts it out on the front step for the ancestor spirits. And in the morning it's gone, and so she knows they're happy. They took the food." And of course, those of us in the Western world, we laugh. What would we say? Yeah, did you put a camera up there and check what critter came by and cleaned it out? But the old lady, no, no, no. And if she didn't put that food out, she was very afraid that some sickness would come, something would happen, see? And so this is actually a very, very powerful view of reality that exists in many what we paternalistically refer to as primitive cultures. You know, in Africa, we notice this. And this has the power of life and death in people's lives. Okay? This is not, we don't understand how terrified they are if you mess up here. Okay? And, well, I could tell you a bunch of stories. But this one was very powerful. But of course, wherever it runs into the Western world, it's getting beat on. Although they've discovered, and I read a fascinating magazine some years ago, I still have access to it, that said actually that this is the prevailing ontology of Africa to this day. And that the Christian view is like a veneer over the old idea. And I have a friend who went to a funeral in Africa of Christian people, and at the end of that he was invited to the home, the widow's home, and when he got there he saw that the pictures of the man had been turned to the wall. Now I don't know what the significance of that is, but that man knew what it was, that she was being deferential to the ancient customs. You don't want to, this thing has a lot of taboos, right? Now if I set up a taboo, what will you as a good Westerner do? Not unconsciously. Yeah, you'll go test it. You'll go and say, well, you know, you said don't go here, and I went there and nothing happened. You understand, in this kind of culture, you would not even think of doing that. And if you did, and the people in your town found out about it, you would be punished or maybe even banished, because you're tempting fate. Okay? We don't understand the power of this, but in some parts of the world, this is absolutely life and death. Yeah. So this one is more the Greek philosophy, where you have these two realms: the ideal realm that's not, it's non-material, and then you have the material realm. And you know, this realm is good and pure. It's spiritual. This is why in some forms of Christianity you have a tension between the body and the soul. That the soul is good and the body is yuck. This is why priests in certain systems don't marry, because sexual activity is part of human carnality, and you avoid that, you're more holy. This is why some people are ascetics. They only eat minimal food. They despise anything pleasurable. It's dangerous. You don't do anything that brings pleasure. And of course, there's the flip side to this too, because if you want to diminish the body, you can also be like the monk who said that the more borderly he lives, the greater the grace of God shines. And so he lived a very loose, lascivious life, and yet proclaimed salvation because God was great. And your body doesn't matter anyway, see. So this has an interesting, it's funny how things can be very opposite in human experience, you know. So this is another one. And then, of course, the last one here, oh, by the way, notice that this is a dualism, and this is a dualism. The last one here is a duality, a difference. And this actually is the biblical view. There's a supernatural realm of the creator, and it's good, and God enjoys creation, and then the natural realm. And these two are not inimical to each other. They're not antagonistic, like in the body-soul item. That there's a difference in status, but not one is not bad and the other good. And of course, in the biblical story, this here is damaged by sin. Okay, this is damaged by sin, and so the transmission of information or coming and going between these two realms is now much more complicated, much more difficult. So you know, those are 6 views of reality, and you ask, well, which ones would allow for deity? Well. This one allows for deity, although it's a very scary proposition. This one allows for deity, but it'd be very remote, because it's up in the realm of perfection. And this one would allow, this is by far the best picture of reality for the function of deity that you find out in the Bible. So again, the story of creation tells us about time as a function of reality. It tells us what kind of time exists. It tells us that there is a deity, and that the deity inhabits a reality that is friendly toward the earth. See? So am I making my points here that there are at least those four big things that the story tells us if you look through the story? The creation-evolution debate never answers those questions. See? So what I'm saying to you is that in my mind, the creation story has become much more significant than just for arguing about creation-evolution, because now I see time as a factor of life. Time flows from beginning to end. There's a God, and the God is in a dynamic that is amenable to the creation. See, so this story is giving us our picture of reality, which is, I think, very significant. Yeah, I already mentioned this. Yeah, I got ahead of myself here. Which one sits behind it? It's this one. And this is the Bible is the only place you find this story, by the way. I mean, this concept of reality. You don't find it anywhere else in philosophy. Philosophy, it's all it could be one of the other ones. Oh, look at that. I got ahead of myself. Sin. Yeah, there are some implications here. And one of the most important is that the material realm is not inherently bad. And I learned this many years ago from a gentleman who was a Jewish man. And we were talking about the Sabbath. And he said, you know, you Protestants, you approach Sabbath very differently from us, the Jews. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you keep the Sabbath. You have all these little rules that you have to protect the Sabbath. But he said, for us, we celebrate the Sabbath. I thought, wow, what do you mean by that? He said, well, this is the day to enjoy the creation God has made. He says, on this Sabbath, he said, in conservative circles, you should have sexual relations with your spouse on Sabbath morning. It's part of the joy of life. And he said, you should have a good meal on the Sabbath day. Good food, eat food. You should have good music. You should have fellowship with people. You should enjoy the sunshine and the rain, and you should rejoice in the world that God has made. Well, that changed my focus on Sabbath quite a bit, and I like to enjoy the Sabbath more than I like to put restrictions on it. But the material realm is not bad. Okay? Humans no longer exist in their ideal state. That's what the sin story is. Yeah. Human impulses are all corrupted, need to be bridled, or we suffer from the tyranny of our desires. I love that phrase. And see, in order for us to thrive because of the problem of sin, we have to go against human nature. Self-discipline, self-abnegation, self-denial are all things that will benefit us, not self-indulgence. And if you disagree with me on that, I would suggest, well, you go try out for the Olympics by self-indulgent means. How far will you get? No. And of course, they go to the extreme. Yeah, I already said this. Yeah, by the way, what I talked about this morning and even now, one of the reasons Christianity is being rejected wholesale by younger people is that it flies in the face of this idolizing of self. Okay? That you are asking me to bridle my self-interest and to bridle my instincts when modern culture tells us that that's how you achieve authenticity. And so Christianity is being thrown out the window wholesale. It's surprising how quickly it's happening. So it also gives us an anthropology. Anthropology, as you know, is the discussion of humans. And you'll notice, and this is a well-known story, that humans are a special creation in the story, that God doesn't just speak them into existence, that he actually forms them and breathes into them the breath of life. And so they are shown to be a special creation, and because they're made by God, they have inherent value. This is why Christians oppose things like euthanasia and what do we call it now? Death with dignity, where you can decide to take your own life. And just this morning I read of a young woman who's 18 who has a lot of depression. She has decided to end her life by medicinal means. And by the way, there's a new invention. Do you want to hear about this? It's a pod, very nicely made, that you can get into and push a button, and in less than 3 minutes you will be gone, because it infuses the whole thing with nitrogen and replaces oxygen, and you just fade away. They say it's a very easy way to die. And there's a company that wants to sell these. They haven't got approval yet, but it's quite a futuristic looking pod. You just get in it and push a button and it's all over. And see, people are saying, well, that's the final evidence of your personal autonomy, is that you can decide when you die. It might be on both places.
The federal government's having the one today with the button on the outside.
Yeah, and you know, in Holland, they've been doing some studies because Holland has allowed doctor-assisted, and they're finding out, and Canada's finding the same thing, that more and more it's becoming people outside of them who are deciding for them. Yeah. And in Canada now, they've changed the law recently where if you have a debilitating disease or you have depression, you can end your life with the help of a physician. Yeah. In the Bible, they're made in two types, male and female, and made to be social beings. Okay, these are all part of the story. Humans are made in the image of God, and there's been a lot of discussion about this, a lot of discussion, but what does this mean? And theologians are not equally decided. They haven't all decided. Some say there's a physical resemblance. Others say, well, no, the human-like language in the Bible is merely anthropomorphical language. It's us trying to understand God. When we talk about the hand of God or the face of God, it's not really talking, it's just how we would understand something. Some people say, well, it's the creative abilities. Others say, no, it's because we have a spiritual sense or capacity. I like T.M. Kitwood. I quoted him in the sermon this morning. He says 3 major components is the capacity to love and be self-giving. Secondly, the possession of a free will. And thirdly, a position of authority. And I think those can be biblically supported, and you realize that in one of those, humans messed up, right? We took authority that was not ours, and by the way, if you go back to that view of reality of the creator and the creatures, the cardinal sin would be for a creature to take the prerogatives of a creator, which would explain the story of Lucifer very directly. Okay? Some capacities are mediated to humans by God in this story, which is very interesting to me. This mediation thing is that what it means is that God built into his creation some mechanisms that he doesn't have to control. He doesn't have to affect. They can function on their own. Every tree bearing its own, every plant with its own seed. God does not have to intervene and make a seed because he set up a mechanism to do that. The same with procreation of humans. That you and I can create other humans and God is not directly involved. Okay, there's a mechanism to do that. Which means, by the way, that God is not involved in every aspect of life on planet Earth. Now this is very disturbing to some people. It's actually very encouraging to me because it means that a lot of the evil that takes place is not the doing of God. Okay, you know, God has set it up, and this world functions. We could talk about natural laws. That these are functions that God built into the system, so he doesn't have to dabble with it. Okay, that's what mediation means. It's very interesting. And then notice that God gave both the men and women the same mandate to care for the world and to populate it. This is interesting, and I'm going to dabble a little bit here because we were looking, I think it was in Sabbath school, I raised the question of Genesis 3, verse 16, where God said to Eve, because of sin, I will multiply your pain in childbirth, and your desire will be to your husband, and he will rule over you. And that's actually been used in history to create a doctrine of male supremacy, where men are given by command of God, according to this theory, jurisdiction over women. This is why women cannot be priests, although there's another theological reason, is that Tertullian actually said that women are only partially formed men. They're not fully formed, and therefore it would be a disgrace for them to be a priest. Nobody subscribes to that here, but I mean, that was his opinion. But what this text is really saying, and the translation of the Bible I have, it says that your desire will be in conflict with your husband. It's saying that because of sin, there's now going to be a rivalry in marriage. There's going to be a tension for dominance, but that the man is going to dominate. And there's probably a biological reason for that, which is delicate. But, you know, childbearing makes it very difficult for a woman to be completely independent. And there's periods of her life when she needs help or some dependency. And we see the struggle in our own culture of single moms, that, you know, they go very quickly into poverty and they struggle enormously. And children with two-parent homes, they do better in life and in school. I mean, there's all kinds of studies done on that. But This is not, this text is not, the text in Genesis is not a permission for men to be the... I knew an old Adventist preacher who said, you know, it is true that God made man the head of the house. Too bad he's so often the blockhead. You know, that's what his way of putting this. That men owe women an apology for the way they get treated sometimes. But the mandate that exists here is the same to Adam and Eve, that they were companions in life and have the same mandate. So we should think much more of parity between men and women. Although they're very different, they have the same kind of mandate. So anthropology, and the last thing I'll talk about is it gives us a day of rest. This is well known in the Adventist circles that the Sabbath is traced back to Genesis. And I want to make two observations here. We should be very mindful about Sabbath in this regard. It is first of all a period of time. In Adventist history, we've made a big deal about the seventh day as a period of time. We have long articles about the seventh day, how it got changed from the first day to the seventh day to the first day. Long talks about that. I have no argument with those. Those are actually very interesting and very substantial. But what we've often missed is it's also an experience. It's not just a time, it's an experience. And if you don't have the time, you don't have the experience. And I still remember getting in a big discussion in college days. I had a friend who was studying nursing, and after he had finished 2 years, he qualified to be a CNA. And so he started taking a double shift on Sabbaths because it was allowed. And I asked him one day, I said, well, okay, so what happens to your Sabbath? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're working a double shift on Sabbath because it's allowable, it's necessary. What about your Sabbath? And he looked at me like I had lost my mind. I said, well, it's an experience, right? What about that? And he said, oh, I had never thought about that. And so some of the best writing about Sabbath is coming from non-Adventists. You know why? Because they're talking about the experience, and we have not paid enough attention to the experience. Sabbath should be a joyous time, not a restrictive time all the time, not all the rules. Okay? I'm not saying the rules are bad, but you know, it's a day of joy, it's a day of fellowship, it's a day of enjoying the natural world, it's a day of thanking God for what he's done, it's a day of worship and praise. It's not just, well, from sundown to sundown. See? But all of this is anchored in the story of Genesis. So those are my thoughts this afternoon. I hope I wasn't too complicated or too complex. But the main points I wanted to make is that it gives us a clear picture of a reality where time is part of the reality, where time is linear, where there's a deity who is interactive with the world, and gives us an anthropology and gives us also a Sabbath day rest. So the story itself is of profound significance to the Christian world if we understand it in its bigger context. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But I'm happy to have some conversation if you would like to. Yeah.
Going back to the duality.
Yeah.
You said that the duality was damaged by sin. So there was a before sin and after.
Yeah.
And it seems like we have all lived after.
Yeah.
So what is our ability to perceive what was before?
Well, we can only imagine. You know, and the text that I love, and this I think about this text sometimes. It talks about how in the cool of the evening, God came down and visited with Adam and Eve. And you think, what would it be like to sit down with Almighty God and have a conversation? You know, we can imagine that maybe, but there's no big separation in the duality. There's the prerogatives of God and the domain of God, which is different from the creaturely world, but it's not an antagonistic one. It's a matter of degree, not of what other word can I use. Does that make sense? Yeah. And see, sin destroyed that. And actually we were talking, I don't remember if it was lunch or at Sabbath school, that, you know, because God is holy and cannot abide evil, in order for sinners to remain alive, he has created a distance, which means that it's much easier for us to misapprehend God. If you could meet with God tonight and have a conversation, you would have a very different opinion or understanding, as if you have to do it by remote means, see. So that's the difference. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Another question. Did anything make sense? Yes, please.
When you were talking about the Greek philosophy, it was intriguing about the concept that perfection doesn't change. And the first thing that came to my mind was that if God persists in creating and God is perfect, then of course there's change and perfection.
Well, see, we have to be careful with the word perfection. In fact, I remember very well
Sure.
After preaching a sermon as a guest in a church, of getting cornered in the lobby by one of the church members, who was very unhappy with me because I had not laid out the saints in lavender about their sins, you know. And he said that if we're trying to achieve perfection, then people like you, he said, pointing to me, should be much more pointed about sin. And so I was charitable to the man. I talked to him, and he said, well, we have to achieve sinlessness in this world. Otherwise, we're not going to heaven. And I said, well, I became frustrated, and I said to him, look, my friend, answer a question for me. Why do you apply the pagan concept of perfection to the Christian world? And he was so shocked that his jaw fell open, and he said, what do you mean? I said, well, the definition you have of perfection is borrowed from the Platonic world, where you have this domain of faultlessness. That's not the biblical understanding of perfection. And he turned around and walked away. He didn't continue, he just was gone. He was so frustrated. You know, well, I didn't mean to do that, but the biblical view of perfection is a growth to maturity. It's the harvest idea that you start as a shoot and you grow to full maturity. That's the biblical understanding of perfection. It's a dynamic process of achieving maturity. But when you talk about perfection, so there again, you know, which definition of perfection are you using?
That ties into the dualities that we've spoken about.
Yeah.
You know, we don't understand half of the duality.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a...
It's an interesting because it's such a staple in philosophical thought.
Yeah. Yeah. But you understand why in the Greek world it had to be a perfect static zone, because if that's the ideal and you allow it to change, it can't become more ideal.
Right.
See? But that's not the concept of a walk with God. You know, it's not a concept. So.
So would that explain then why Adam and Eve had to be tested before, like they had the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they were supposed to obey what God asked them to do? And it was almost like some kind of probationary period to see how they would respond to the directives of God?
You know, I think it's more has to do with them demonstrating by their own free will to be loyal to God.
Precisely,
Yeah.
precisely.
Yeah.
But they're already perfect, but in some way they're being perfected.
Yeah, and actually their perfection is being tested, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
And see, this is why, and I mentioned this in Sabbath school, and I had a wonderful time in Sabbath school. Some of you picked on me, but I forgive you. You know, well, now for what I was going to say. Yeah, this question of curiosity is a fascinating question, because curiosity in some ways is a wonderful thing, but it's also something that can bring trouble down on your head. And I think Lucifer, his curiosity brought trouble down on his head because he pursued it too far. I'm sure Eve was fascinated by the question of Satan, of the serpent. Won't it be better if you know both good and evil? I hadn't thought of that, see? And so you become curious, and curiosity can either lead to good or to bad. You have to manage it carefully, and I think that Eve was deceived, and she took one step too far. Yeah.
Lying is effective.
What?
Lying is effective or wouldn't be used.
Lying is effective initially, but it usually has a horrible tail on it.
Yeah, and that lying was what was.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And you know, I don't know if you've ever been accused by anybody of something false. I have several times in my life, even on the internet, I've been accused of things that, and I've always debated, well, do I go and fight for myself and straighten this out, or do I just leave it alone? And so far, you know what I've chosen to do? Leave it alone. Let it have its own life. Because once people raise doubt about you, and you start defending yourself, it raises doubt in other people's minds. Why are you defending yourself? You know, it becomes a very strange event. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that, you're right, that lying does work, and that's why people use it. But then the truth comes out.
Right. And then for your when people accuse you, there's no way to articulate evil or false. And that's what you're trying to do when you're trying to defend yourself, is articulate what's wrong with their argument.
Yeah.
And they'll just shift,
Yeah.
and you'll never hit it.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you see with these different systems of belief, do you see how is that shaping the evangelical Christian world today in its desire to return to our Christian roots as a nation?
Well, I think in the Christian world that there's three main ontologies that exist. The sacral one does exist. And I know Christians who are very superstitious, okay? That it's kind of like the people who go to a ball game, and in order to make sure the team wins, you wear the same shirt every time, you know. I know people who hang rabbits' feet on their mirrors, and I had a grade school teacher, and she laughed one day. She told us that she was at her grandmother's house once, and they were drying the dishes and the silverware, and her grandmother dropped a dinner fork on the ground, and it ended up with the tines up. And she picked it up and said, "Oh my, we better start making supper." And the little girl said, "Why?" She said, "Well, because we're going to have guests. Then if you drop a dinner fork and it points up, it means you're going to have guests at the next meal." And that's superstition. And I don't know. I don't know if they did or not. That would be very funny if they did come, wouldn't it? It would prove your superstition to be right. But that exists, and I know some Adventists who are very superstitious about that. I think the main one in the evangelical world is the antagonistic one. I think it's the main one. Not only because of the presence of an immortal soul, but we really do have a thing where we think that the body is a bad thing and the spirit is a good thing. And whole systems of Christian thought are built around that, where you diminish the functions of the body, but you elevate the functions of the soul. And that you're a good man if you dabble with the soul, but you diminish the body. See, we don't see them two as holistic. Yeah. The end. Well, folks, thank you for listening to me. I've talked about it in a few places. I just hope that you go from here realizing that the story of Genesis 1 is much grander than just the creation-evolution debate. It gives us the whole picture of reality that includes a deity with time moving to a destination. And I think that's a marvelous thing that we should not escape. So.
One more thing. What do you think about Genesis? A lot of the things in Genesis are co-opted by pop culture.
Like?
Creation, the rainbow, Sabbath. There's an alternate for all of these things.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Where does that fit in this?
Well, I don't know. I mean, anytime you have a genuineness, there's going to be a counterfeit. And I mean, I've been overseas with $50 bills, and they don't like $50 bills overseas, or $100 bills. They don't like them. You know why? Yeah, they counterfeit so much. $100 bill, American $100 bill overseas, nobody wants it because there's so many counterfeits. You can take $10 and $20 bills and they're fine, but not a $100 bill. And so I don't know. I am fascinated in a strange kind of way at the diversity of opinions that exist in the Christian world. Okay, because I'll just pick the one. If you look at the Sabbath. From Genesis to Revelation, it's very clear from a simple reading of the Bible that the seventh day is a Sabbath. It appears from the beginning to the end. Most of the Christian world doesn't subscribe to that. Okay? The other one that fascinates me is the idea of an inherently immortal soul. Where in the Bible is it talk about an inherently immortal soul? It uses the word soul, but the Hebrew word means a breathing being. It's even applied to cattle, the word soul. If you have immortal souls that go to their destiny when you die, what's the point of the resurrection? See, that you have these anomalies in Christian thought that I don't understand, okay, how they exist. Especially if you dig into the history behind them, In fact, I've read theological books today that say, for example, that very clearly the 7 days of Sabbath in the Bible, but we don't observe it because X, Y, Z. Okay, well then don't argue for the preeminence of Scripture.
There you go.
See, don't do that. See? And I've seen people write, theologians write, that the idea of an immortal soul comes from Plato. So why am I using it in the Bible? See, these are two big things that are very strange to me. But the truth is that in early Christian era, after Christianity became the religion of the empire, a lot of people joined the Christian church because it was good for them socially. And they brought with them ideas, and you can look at Philo of Alexandria, you can look at Augustine, you can look at Thomas Aquinas. These are all people who spent a lot of time trying to merge Greek thought with biblical thought. And in doing so, they borrowed mostly the categories of Greek thought to impose on Christianity. And that's where I think the sad news comes from. So, Marshall, you have the last word. You're in charge around here. So, all right, I'll pray for us. Father in heaven, thank you for a Sabbath day. At least for me, it's been a day of happiness and joy, seeing people I know and used to teach, and seeing acquaintances here in this church, and preaching, and sharing a good meal, and time to talk this afternoon. And now I'm going to go home. Look forward to seeing my wife again and home. Lord, make us a blessing in this world, and help us to orient our lives after the great truths of the Bible. It brings us joy to know that there is a divine being who is interactive in history and who cares about us and loves us and is working toward a destiny. So keep that hope alive in our hearts, we pray in Christ's name.